What's up, everybody? I'm Stan, and welcome to Detail Comics, where we go over comics in detail. This is Shelf Appeal, the weekly show where I go over all the comic books that I picked up this week, give you my impressions on them, and let you know whether there's something you should go back to your shop for or not. To start off with, we're going to talk about Suicide Squad number 8. So I've made no bones about it. Suicide Squad is a book that I've dropped from my pull list, but primarily I picked this one up because it's going to lead directly into Justice League versus Suicide Squad. But it's not the main story that ties into that, it's the after story, the one about Killer Frost. So as far as the main story goes, obviously I'm going to be confused because I haven't been following along with the last 3 parts of this story arc, but overall, it's okay. I'm probably going to have to go back and read it in trade or something like that, just to get a little bit better impression, but overall, it still seems like the story is being told in the exact same way. It's pretty, but it didn't quite have the depth, but I've been hearing kind of mixed reviews, so I might go back and revisit it. As far as the Killer Frost story, I really like this portrayal of Caitlin Snow. It shows an insecure person on the inside while being a front, a real pretty big badass on the outside, and I really like that portrayal. Very fun and very interesting take on that, and if that's how the rest of the series is going to be written, if that's how the Justice League Suicide Squad crossover is going to be, I am all about getting into that. Another book that's tying into an event is Silk number 15. So Silk number 15 continues the trend of being pretty much non-factor in the actual storyline itself. So we see the continued story of Cindy Moon kind of taking on this persona of Silkworm, and she ends up in conflict with Maddie Franklin, and they just duke it out for like 14 pages. We also go back to Spectro, who's, Hector, her ex-dead boyfriend kind of situation, and he runs afoul of Dr. Octopus, who locks him up in a lab, and there is still very little impact associated with the actual storyline. You do get the occasional Electro moment. There's very little that's going to have any kind of impact on the actual story itself at this point. However, there is a book from Marvel that is showing some continued strength, and that is Mosaic number 3. So Mosaic is a really interesting story about Morris Sackett, and what we see is that he is back at his own kind of like crib, and his girlfriend shows up, but the more important thing is that Fife is there, who's the first person that he ever inhabited, and we actually find out about some of the limitations of Mosaic's powers. So while he inhabits one person and he gains some of their memories and some of their knowledge, when he jumps over to another person, we realize now that he can't go back into that original person. So this is a one and done kind of situation. He can jump into anybody, but he can only jump into them once. And I'm not sure if there's some sort of time limit or if it's just a complete blanket restriction, and there's ultimately some very serious issues, some consequences for trying to re-merge with that person originally. But they retain some of Morris's information, so it's a swap, they're sharing every experience, and then slowly those experiences dissipate out of the individual. So that's a really cool development in the character, and I'm really glad that they stuck that in there. The unfortunate thing is that because he jumps into Cece, the assistant of his girlfriend, he finds out some really serious stuff is going on behind the scenes that he's not really super excited about. But the cool part at the end of the book is that he gained himself a pretty super ride. So Spider-Man is now part of the Mosaic hybrid scheme, and I'm interested to see what that's all about. So you've got me for at least issue number 4, so that way I can see what happens with Spider-Man under the control of Morris Sackett and where things go from there, because you know what? If he's inside his head, he knows everything about Spider-Man, and what is that going to mean to him? That's a really interesting idea. Another book that is getting really good is Jessica Jones number 3. So this is a book where I was just like, I'm on it, I'm off it, I'm on it, I'm off it. I didn't really care too much after issue number 2, but the rapport that she had with the Spot in issue number 3, this Allison character, and the whole portrayal of Jessica Jones and how this situation unfolded has me really intrigued about what's going on. Because if you remember the Allison character, Allison was the one that was falsely accused of having the briefcase in Civil War II, so she ultimately seems to be behind some sort of super shady secret organization, and she's got the Spot in kind of her employ, so it's going to be really odd to see how Brian Michael Bendis really handles this situation. Plus, you've got the overall tensions between Luke Cage, Jessica Jones, and the entire people around there because of the homicide that's going on. So Jessica Jones is continuing to get better and better, and this was a really strong issue compared to, say, the first 1 or 2, which didn't really grab me in that same kind of way. I'm really excited about where this one's going just because of this small little section of story, and it was really appealing at that point in time. Another book that's gotten continually interesting is Green Valley number 3. So this is a story written by Max Landis, and this is really kind of cool because we see the Knights of Colodia. They're banded together, they're going into the Green Valley, and then they're about to face off against the Black Wizard, Cyril, and you get this kind of impression. Like, if I was a betting man at the beginning of this book, I would have totally pegged this kind of situation to be happening, because it just seemed like that's the kind of story that Max Landis would tell. As being familiar with his other works, it's just like, okay, that's a pretty cool kind of twist. So if this is a movie, and we're talking about Max Landis, so he writes movies, he writes TV shows. If this is Act 1, this is the conclusion of Act 1, where, you get the small reveal, and you're going to go to Act 2, and then Act 3 is going to be where everything big happens. So this is just kind of stoking the fire to get everybody amped up for where this could possibly go in the future. I definitely recommend picking up Green Valley. It's a really fun independent title, and definitely something that should be interesting for most people. However, we need to talk about my surprise favorite book of the week. And I mean, I had zero expectations going into this book, and that is Spider-Man number 10. So the reason that I say that Spider-Man 10 is probably one of the best books of the entire week, if it's probably the best book out of the Spider-Man run so far. So like out of issues 1 through 10, 10 is like the pinnacle of what a Spider-Man story, like for Miles Morales, would be. Because Brian Michael Bendis, like, here's the reason to enjoy Brian Michael Bendis' writing. With this, he tells a story about 2, 3, 4 kids in a dorm room talking about stuff. That's it. Like, the action that you all get is in backstory, and it's from, like, an entirely Miles Morales-based perspective. There's no other people offering their opinion. There's nothing like that. It's just Miles recounting the story in how he experienced this entire situation. And that made it very personal. It made it very emotional. The art from Nico Leone was extremely good. I mean, I'm going to have to go into depth in this in an actual review of the comic book itself, just because it's huge. But, like, this is a book where, I mean, you didn't need the Civil War II event for this book to be good. And that's why it's probably one of the best books. The fact that it's tied into Civil War II doesn't matter at all, because the story just hits on such a personal and emotional level. Huge recommendation for this one, especially if you've been keeping up with Civil War II, which I don't know why you would, but this is just a standout piece. This is what you would have wanted from the actual main book, and you only get it in offshoots and tie-ins and very personal character stories. The next book we're going to be talking about is Hal Jordan, the Green Lantern Corps, number 10. So this is a journey for Hal Jordan through this emerald space, which is where all the deceased lanterns end up. He is basically pulled from this because, well, Abin-Sur's, or the embodiment of Abin-Sur inside the emerald space, tells Hal Jordan that it is not his time. He is still needed. So he gets pulled back out into the world, and that's where we're at now. This is a necessary moment, but they used it, they didn't focus too much on the Guardians, Ganthet, they didn't focus too much on Kyle. It was still very much a Hal Jordan-centric story, which is probably one of the best things about this book. When they do Hal Jordan is a great part of the story. It's a great book when they do that. And then when they bounce off of stuff, everything needs to be in relation to Hal Jordan because, well, at least for me, the connective tissue of John Stewart and the rest of the Corps isn't quite there for me. It just doesn't feel as close and as personal. I'm a big fan of individual tales or development of individual characters, and I find that that's much more apparent when Hal Jordan is the main focus. And talking about the development of individual characters, we have Flash number 12, so where they're still in the Shadowlands, and you've got Aunt Iris, who's kind of corrupted in all this respect. So it gets to the situation where they're totally surrounded by shadows, they're into the darkness. It's just like, he tried just to give him a little science lesson, he tries to teach Wally West a little bit. It's just like, okay, well, what happens when you turn on the light? Oh, it's instantaneously bright. What happens when you turn off the lights? It's instantaneously dark, because dark is as fast as light. The only thing that they can do is they can vibrate, and when they vibrate, they find out that Wally West's, Kid Flash's interpretation of vibration is different than Barry Allen's. So it's always a teachable moment for Barry. So you get a little bit of growth for Kid Flash, and then you see some progression for Barry. I don't know how much time has passed between the Godspeed arc and this one, but there is some development at the end of the issue that is going to have people like, it's like back to pre-Flashpoint, pre-New 52 kind of Barry Allen. So it should be pretty interesting to see where this one goes, but ultimately I was really a big fan of this. The big question that I have, though, is the Shade. Where is he from? No, more importantly, when is he from? Because his interpretation of the situation between Iris and Barry is very telling. So I'm really interested to see what that's all about. Another book that I thought was really cool was Action Comics 969. So this book is the Men of Steel arc. And what it started out was like this kind of Godslayer teaser thing, but it turned into the Men of Steel because essentially it was a Superman and Lex Luthor story. So Patrick Zircher does a crushing job on the actual art itself. It's fantastic. I really like the way this is laid out. And I like the development that's going on here because they take Lex Luthor off-world. He's in his armor, and they kind of debilitate that. And so it's not really a huge consequence. But we finally learn what the backstory is between Elcol, Zane, and how they're on this mission. So essentially there's this this seer that is sending these guys out on their missions in order to prevent the evisceration and the destruction of millions of lives and saving billions of people every single time. I really like Action Comics. It's not necessarily as strong as Superman as far as a series goes, but it is very close between the two, and ultimately, whether you want a little bit more action-oriented story in Action Comics or a little bit more personal story in Superman, there is definitely a good option for either of you when it comes to these books overall. Very highly recommended. Another Superman story is Deathstroke number 8. So this is a battle between Slade Wilson and Superman on a battleship in the middle of international waters, and it is probably the best issue out of the entire run so far, at least in my mind. Because this is really kind of showing, it's very much an introspective piece on Superman, on Slade Wilson, and how he goes about things. You know, it's not necessarily about tactics and strategies when it comes to Slade. There's also psychological warfare that goes on to that. So in a very one-sided kind of battle, Slade Wilson uses those things to his advantage because he knows that this new Superman has just been sent over as a government watchdog to try and take him in because somebody told him to do so, you know, to try and make him feel obligated for his sense of justice. And what we see is there's a whole big conflict between Superman and Slade Wilson throughout the entire story. And I mean, it's staggering, man. Like, this is going to be a run to read in trade. Like, this is going to be a phenomenal series to read in succession, just like one after the other, after the other, after the other, because it's telling a really good story about how Deathstroke matches up against some of the best that DC has to offer as far as superheroes goes. So I'm really excited about Deathstroke. I can't wait to see where the second arc goes, because the conclusion of this one was super fun. So definitely recommend Deathstroke. If you haven't picked up number 1, go grab all of them. They're great, and it's fun to read a bad guy being good at being bad, I think. It's kind of confusing, but yes, recommended from me. Another book that I can't help but recommend is Wonder Woman number 12. So after the end of the Lies story arc that happened in last issue, we have the continuation of Year 1, and this is post kind of terrorist threat. So essentially they were out eating lunch and whatnot, and then a bunch of different terrorists from the Seer group came in and they started killing people, and Diana found her powers and she went just ham on these guys, just super badass Wonder Woman style. And that was awesome. So we see some very touching, engaging interrogation moments, those kind of things. The art from Nicholas Scott has this fantastic way to capture the emotion, the emotional structure on everybody's individual faces and things like that. It just always felt like there was something going on underneath the surface, which was fantastic. I really appreciated the art style on this. And then what we see is that the Seer group, obviously, is an anagram for somebody else's name. And if it's only 4 letters, it's pretty easy to find out. But the introduction of the God of War into the Year 1 storyline is pretty stellar. You know, overall he comes in just like a badass, ready to throw down with the Amazon princess. The big thing is that we're getting that harkening back to this black tree that was on Themyscira, and that's when the whole snake bite and everything like that happened under Wonder Woman's wrist. So that, I feel, is going to be the key point that Greg Rucka is going to kind of hold on to as far as the overall structure of Wonder Woman and how her history moved forward after that event. That's where his defining characteristic for how he's going to write the definitive Wonder Woman story is going to be. So that's definitely a key point to watch out for. So after we walk away from Wonder Woman, we're going to end up at Detective Comics 946, which continues the Victim Syndicate. And this is like Tom King's Batman did a different psychological take on Batman, and James Tynion's Batman is doing a completely different psychological take on Batman. They're not mutually exclusive, so it's not like we're writing 2 different Batmen. It's just that they're focusing on different parts of their personality, and this is totally a psychological Batman story. And I mean, it was awesome. Like, you get a throwback to Tim Drake's Red Robin and what their perspective was when they created the Belfry, and how Tim always saw things in a much brighter light than what Bruce sees them in. And it was just a very good contrast, and that was so cool to see. Overall, this is a book that I highly recommend that you read. James Tynion is writing probably the best Batman book out at DC right now. I mean, I really like Batman from Tom King, but this is just, Detective Comics has been a stellar standout. There has been like no bad issues for it. I mean, it is right there neck and neck with Superman as one of the best titles that is coming out from DC right now. I highly recommend that you go grab it, and I'm not going to talk about it too much because I got to do a review and I don't want to spoil it unless you guys really want it spoiled. And now that we're done with Detective, we're going to talk about Descender number 17. So this is the beginning of a brand new story arc called, I think, orbital dynamics or something along those lines. And what Jeff Lemire has been doing a really good job of is telling emotional stories for characters that you wouldn't necessarily expect to be emotional. So you saw this really cool story about the puppy kind of robot. You saw this really great tale between Andy and Effie and how they kind of came to be, you know, where they met each other, how they started their romance and those kind of things. And then you've got the story of Tim, and there's just so much good emotional character-driven development, a lot of connection you can make with characters that when you start up this book, you remember it's just like, holy shit, Tim 21 and Tim 22 are fighting, you know, and they're like, Tim 22 is trying to destroy Tim 21. And then you've got Andy and you've got Effie, and they're kind of in conflict, but they don't necessarily, they're trying to work together, but they're not, and it's just really seriously an issue for that. And then you've also got, you know, the captives. So you've got Dr. Kwan and you've got everybody like that, and they're trying to escape and get out of the situation with Tim 21 intact and head back to wherever they need to go. And the crazy thing is that Jeff Lemire and Dustin Nguyen write this book so that way there are 10 pages of nothing but art. Everything is told in the story panels and the visuals. And that is so goddamn cool. I mean, it was just like, there was nothing to miss. Like, the text would not have added anything except for unnecessary exposition. The way that the panels were structured, the way that the art was styled, you understood that this story wasn't about, like, what was going on. It was about desperation. And if you look at each individual story, you can see the different types of desperation in those situations. Overall, Descender is a standout book. I can't recommend it enough. Go back and get the trades and get caught up because you're going to love it. It's great. It's one of my favorite independent books coming out right now. Another independent book coming out right now is Reborn. So Reborn number 3 by Mark Miller and Greg Capullo is coming out, and I really like the visuals. I feel like the story, I'm going to stick by it. It's still written very much like it's a treatment, like it's a screenplay, like it's meant to be a movie, it's a script, because it's not necessarily offering all the kinds of depth and detail that I want to these individual characters or those individual scenarios. I don't know if they're necessarily storing that up for later, or if they're just considering that it doesn't necessarily need to be explained in that kind of situation. Like, there's very serious aspects where they're talking about, it's just like, oh yeah, when he showed up, he's old. It's just like, nobody understands why people show up at the ages they show up at, or when they show up, at the times that they show up at, or all these other kinds of things that aren't really fleshed out in the world are really kind of funky, or why there's a mix of technology with fantasy elements, and then what is this warrior skill, and how the hell is Big Tom so goddamn strong, and what's with this magical sword, and why are some of the cats like people, and there's just so much stuff going on in this where it's like making me ask a lot of questions that I'm not getting answers to, which is frustrating, but then I remember how good it looks, and I'm like, well, it's really pretty. So I kind of keep going with it. It's one of those things where if I want to turn my brain down a little bit and I want to just, enjoy it for the spectacle that it is, I could totally see this is a movie, this is a blockbuster, and you could turn it into something so great like that. But for somebody that likes to dive a little bit deeper into the story of a comic book, or the emotive aspects, or the character development, and those kind of things, I'm just not seeing all that depth and detail that I really want out of a story like this. But it's definitely one that I'm going to keep picking up because it just looks fantastic and it's fun at its core, which is one of the most important things about a comic book. And then another standout of the week was Amazing Spider-Man Renew Your Vows number 2. So we've talked about this before, but Amazing Spider-Man Renew Your Vows number 1 had a little bit more of a truncated kind of feel to the main storyline because there were 2 backup stories that didn't necessarily need to be there. And then it was kind of like a really cliche, trite kind of ending. And what we see here is that Jerry Conway and Ryan Stegman, they go back to where that story began, just after breakfast and all that kind of stuff, and then see where those things move forward from that point in time. And they do it from the perspective of Mary Jane. And this is probably one of the best Mary Jane stories I've read that I can remember. Like, it's just putting her voice into this story is awesome, and the perspective that it's coming from and how she's kind of defining her own personality. Mary Jane is going to become a much more prominent character, and it's going to be a partnership between Peter Parker and Mary Jane in this book, not necessarily just Peter Parker, who happens to be married to Mary Jane and happens to have a daughter. This is going to be a family story, and I really like that aspect. It makes the kind of truncated and kind of easily written conclusion to the first issue not necessarily feel so bad, because I get a different pathway to go there. So it's just like, if this is the culminating act, I totally get that, because we need a reason for all these paths to kind of converge on one and then move the story forward. So we've got to develop the world, we've got to develop the characters, and this does a great job at that. Amazing Spider-Man Renew Your Vows, probably going to be outselling Amazing Spider-Man, the main book, for quite some time, especially if it keeps up like this. And to finish things off, we have Inhumans versus X-Men #1. So, this book, man, let's moment of honesty here. As far as Inhumans versus X-Men go, I read Inhumans versus X-Men #0, which kind of gave me the backstory. I like Kenneth Rocafort's art, and it gave me this moment between Death of X, which I read the entire thing of, all the way through the 8 months in between Death of X as well as IVX #1. And what Inhumans versus X-Men #1 gives me is a poor conflict. Like, something with some very easy solutions, surrounded by some really cool espionage, infiltration scenes. Like, the action that's written into this, the conflict between the individual characters, the whole boardroom meeting, and how everything sets up as the plot kind of goes along, is badass. Like, it's just like the actual kind of nuance of how everybody's kind of weaving into the story, and this kind of plot that is happening underneath the Inhumans' nose is just great. I loved every aspect about that, because it just felt like it's like, oh, this is how everything, like the subversion aspect of it, that's how everything would work. But the fact that it's based off of the fact that it's just like Hank McCoy is just like, hey, we can just leave the planet, man. Everybody can live. Everybody can survive. All we have to do is go out into space, and we can totally find an inhabitable planet. We can have adventures all over the galaxy. We can become the Space X-Men, and we can have a really great time. We can go cosmic. But nope. Everybody else is just like, but this is our planet. Why do the Inhumans have any right different than us? And it's just like, shit. So, like, the whole conflict, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of what the kind of linchpin of this whole situation is, and knowing Emma's real motivations and the backstory behind how this thing gets set up, because it really becomes a very personal vendetta for Emma Frost, and everybody's kind of going along with this aspect, whether they know or they don't know. There is so much good about what's going on in the book compared to what the book is based on. So, it's got me for issue #2, I think. I think I'm going to stick with it for that point in time. This is probably a book that you're going to want to read as an omnibus, particularly when it collects all the other tie-ins, because there's so many books that are tying in. You've got, like, The Uncanny Inhumans, The Extraordinary X-Men, Deadpool and the Mercs for Money is tying into this. There's a lot of different tie-ins that are involving Inhumans and the mutant kind that are just pouring into this thing, and I'm just like, hey, it's a little overwhelming, especially when I've got a situation like Clone Conspiracy, where the main story is telling all the details. Amazing Spider-Man's the only tie-in that really has any kind of consequence, and the other two are really just kind of, and they don't really matter. So, Inhumans versus X-Men #1. Go for the intrigue. Make your own decision as to whether it's something you want to stick in with. I can totally understand if you're fatigued by it, because I am really close too. So those are the books that I picked up this week and what I thought of them, but I want to know what you guys think too, of course, so hit me up in the comments down below and we can start that conversation. As always, if you like what you see, hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe right there to get more news, reviews, and commentary on comic books, comic book movies, comic book TV shows and games, and anything and everything inside the world of comics.